Hi and welcome to part 3 of this 3-part mini-series all about Reese Bass sound design with myself, DC Breaks, here on the DBS Institute YouTube channel. In parts 1 and 2 we looked at the original Reese Bass, a workflow for recreating that sound using just pure sine tones within Phase Plant, looking at detuning, a little bit of distortion and recreating the exact harmonic series used within that original sound. Then in part 2 we looked at a sampling workflow for recreating how that sound was then sampled in jungle and drum bass and other genres and kind of evolved through the use of distortion, filtering and some other creative effects. Now in this final part we're going to look at some more modern Reese Bass sound design, leaning on some of those original workflows and ideas around layering of different waveforms and application of filters and distortion, but really pushing that envelope really as far as you can go to create some new and modern tearing Reese basses. So let's get stuck in. So let's start off with quite a simple but powerful and really classic sounding saw Reese. So rather than using sine waves, we're of course now using a saw wave, and this is actually a wavetable. So the first frame that you can see here, frame 1, is a classic saw wave shape, but as we sweep through the different frames you can see actually what's happening is different harmonics are being added, and the final frame here, so this blends between these two shapes effectively, is essentially another saw wave, but you can see the frequency of the saw shape has increased. I can't be bothered to count. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, so it's like 8 times. So if I just play a note now, it's essentially just pitched up. We'll see why that's useful later on, but for now we're just going to use the original sort of simple saw wave, if you like. We're going to layer that with a sine wave to get a slightly fatter tone. Let's just look at the difference that makes. So just going to loop actually an F. So we can see our saw wave, we can see all these dense harmonics going up through the frequency spectrum. Let's add in a sine layer. You can see just adding a lot of weight to that first fundamental, making it more bassy. So now let's add in some unison. So really using that workflow from the sampling workflow. There's lots of different unison modes within Phase Plant. The main ones for bass design really are going to be these unison ones here, hard, smooth and synthetic, or perhaps these creative ones. The chord ones tend to be better suited to chords, pads and melodic type of instruments. So I'm just going to use 2 voices to basically detune 2 instances of this wave against itself, and then using a bit of spread to create some stereo width. Let's see how that kind of affects our sound now. And you can see we get this lovely weird pattern through the harmonics, which is caused essentially by this detuning. So apart from looking cool, it also sounds a lot more kind of sort of spacey and a bit more interesting sonically, I think. And particularly when we start to add in distortion, so this is going to be running on lane 2. I've set up a macro here to be able to control the amount of distortion like so. So that's just basically going to give us more signal. Let's try dialing in some of that now. Quite subtle, but you can hear that's definitely adding some grit. And then in lane 3, as we had before, a bit of brightness on the EQ, a limiter, a bit of reverb just to soften it up a bit. We've got a stereo control here, which we can use just to kind of shape the overall stereo width, which is kind of handy when you're using multiple voices, just to kind of control the stereo image of the sound. So we can see this is now everything's just a lot louder really because of the distortion that we're using here. It's probably actually a little bit too much. I'm going to dial that back a bit. I've also put in this ensemble plugin here, but we'll leave that off for a moment and come back to that. And then the other thing I want to do, this still sounds a little bit weak and washy, so I'm going to use a global unison to create some more voices. This time I'm using a frequency stack. Again, you can experiment to see kind of what sounds good, and there's no kind of right or wrong here apart from just using your ears to decide what sounds good. Let's hear how that adds a certain weight to the Reese now. So it's really night and day. And we can actually see just what a difference that makes. What it's really doing actually is kind of disturbing the kind of quite clear pattern that we have here through the harmonic. So we can think of this as a bit like in the original Reese, the beating pattern is kind of giving it that movement. And by adding in this particular style of unison, it's kind of completely shattering that, making everything a lot more, I guess, yeah, kind of distorted sounding, a lot more messy, a lot more brash and raw. And that's kind of what you want from a Reese. You want it to be this kind of raw, full-on sonic assault. So this then sound we can start to shape in other ways. So typically, again, we could go back to using sort of some pitch bend on it, which happened quite a lot. Tracks like Space Hopper by Bad Company spring to mind. So we're kind of in the early 2000s now in terms of the way that the sound evolved. And we can then also start to add in some movement using an LFO. So I mentioned earlier the Wavetable. We could perhaps try sweeping through these different frames using our LFO. I'm going to set up a quick macro to be able to control the speed that the LFO is running at. I'm just going to actually bring this down a bit slower first. And then just link this to this like so. I can choose the amount. So now as I turn up macro 2, let's just rename this rate. We can then start to hear this, how this sounds. So on this first macro here, I've assigned this to the width or the depth, if you like, of the of how much the LFO modulator is changing the rate. So as this kind of increases, you'll see and you'll start to hear that the frame changes more as I open up the macro. So let's just hit play. And so using those different macros, we've added some movement, we've got a nice big fat rich texture, and that is really what you want from a Reese. So a few different styles of working there, and these are all kind of macros that I would then look to automate, write a bass part, and kind of refine and tweak to get it doing exactly what I want it to do. But that's one workflow and one way of designing a more modern sounding Reese within Phase Plant. So in this next example, we're going to start introducing a little bit of frequency modulation to create some really round, fat textures, particularly in the low end. So we're going to start off with a very simple, similar approach as to the approach we've used before. This time, rather than using a saw, I'm using a triangle. I'm once again using unison, but just for a bit of variation, I'm using the different mode, this time the smooth mode. And I've set up a macro to control the amount of detune, which we'll see why that's really important to this particular sound in just a moment. We then have our sine layer, and we're going to be using this as a way of creating movement and beating through the sound by using frequency modulation, essentially. And then I have this FM control layer, which is currently turned off, and I'll show you why that is the case in just a moment. But let's just listen to how the sound sounds at the moment. Everything's running through a low pass filter, then into some distortion with the facturator that we've seen before. That's then running through another filter, also a low pass, which I've just used to set up a macro over here, so we can actually turn this off. It's not going to do anything really at the moment, although it's providing a little bit of extra drive. Once again, that kind of scoop sound on the 3-band EQ just to kind of brighten up the top again. Having run through that filter and the distortion, you kind of need that to bring it back up to level. And then limiter and reverb as we had previously. So this is currently what it sounds like. So let's add in this FM control and explain what this is doing. So as you can see, this is a sine wave, and I'm taking the output of this and I'm routing some of it to the shift of the sine layer. You can see instantly the effect that that has on our sine wave. And then likewise, it's also being routed up to the shift on our triangle. And once again, you can kind of see how that's affecting the triangle wave there. So I mentioned earlier that this macro here has been assigned to this detune amount. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to use this macro here to control the sync of the sine wave. So as you can see, this goes up. It's you can think of sync a little bit like a pitch control, but it's working within blocks. So if you see, you can kind of imagine these some imaginary lines on different cycles of our original sine wave, and it's kind of like a pulse width control really within those blocks. So it works a little bit like pitch, but a bit differently. So as I turn this up, that's going to change our FM controller, if you like, and that's going to be affecting the pitch of our triangle layers and our sine layers independently. So let's listen to how that sounds. And I'm playing the one note, which is important because for this particular effect, depending on what note you're playing, you're going to get a different amount of frequency modulation. You're going to get different textures and tones on different notes, which can be a good workflow for sampling some different sounds. But for consistency, we're just going to use the one note to start with. So let's hear how that sounds. And you can hear straight away we're getting that kind of consistent beating. And as we move the frequency modulation, I've put a exclamation mark there to remind myself this is very, very sensitive because it's going to control the amount quite a lot. And so just sweeping through those values there, you can hear at times when the beating is really almost like in sync with itself and creates these cool kind of oscillations, and other times it doesn't sound so good. But that can also be a really nice way to explore some different tones and some different textures and different movement. And that's why I've also created that original macro on the detune to fine tune the amount of movement that we're getting. So if we find a texture that we like, we can then really drill down and kind of control the oscillation a bit more subtly as well. So I'm actually just going to try this on some different notes just to kind of show you how the note that it's playing can affect that as well. And again, some of these sound horrible, but occasionally, just by trying some different notes, you find ones which are really good. And if you find one that you quite like that note, you can kind of fine tune it with these controls until you get something that you're kind of happy with. And then once again, we can use pitch, bend and things like that and kind of start to make some actual bass sounds that we want to use in our tune. Again, it can be quite a raw sound, so it needs a little bit of sort of manual tweaking to find a note that sounds really good. But this is a great workflow for getting some really deep and fat sounding bass sounds. You'd hear it on tracks like Shell Shock by Noisier, for example. Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the content. Just to let you know that we offer online courses in a range of creative subjects. So if you're interested in taking your skills and knowledge to the next level, check out the link below. Okay, so this next sound isn't really technically, I guess, a Reese sound, although today the term Reese is a bit of a byword for any kind of distorted bass sound, but it uses a number of different techniques that we've looked at so far. So we're going to be using a wavetable. This time it's taken from a sample. So this is a technique you might be familiar with from Serum, if you use Serum. And essentially what it allows us to do is to take a sample and convert different parts of that sample into individual waves, which are then spread out in our wavetable, which we can then cycle through in different creative ways to kind of recreate that sound. So individually, we can play some of these frames and get different textures, which can be cool. But really, as I said, the main benefit of doing this is being able to sweep through these. So let's turn on an LFO, and you'll hear that this has been set up to once again sweep through the different frames, and the amount is controlled here. So if we want to get through the whole sample, it's like right up there. Otherwise we can just sweep through different parts of it. We can start the frame at 1, or we can start it wherever we like. This was a kind of originally a growl type of bass sound. So let's hear how that sounds. Of course, we can change the rate as well to make it faster. Bring in our old friend, the pitch bend. So this is really good for bass music, EDM, dubstep, that kind of stuff as well. And then we can really start to get creative because it's not a sample. It's now a wavetable synth. We can start to bring in some of the other techniques that we've already seen as well. So for example, we could bring in a sine wave. And if we wanted to add in some weight, we might want to add in a sub layer using a sine wave, as we've seen. But the problem with doing this just in this way is that it's just going to be there the whole time. So what we can do is we can take the output of our wavetable here and apply it to different aspects of this sine. So for example, the level, and then we can kind of encode what's going on here onto our sine layer to give the sine layer its own movement based on the wavetable. So this can create some really interesting effects and kind of glue the two together in a lot more cohesive way. So that sounds really flat because we've just got the sine kind of running through the whole time. If we adjust the level, it gives that the same kind of movement that we've got from our wavetable onto the sine layer. The other thing we can then start to do is to use our LFO, or at least the LFO, whatever the LFO is doing here, is going to also then be kind of mapped to our sine wave. So if we slow this right down, now it still sounds a little bit like nasally. So something else that we could do is perhaps increase the range to make it a bit more extreme. Just slow it down a little bit. Get through a bit more of the sample. We could apply a little bit of shift, just a very small amount to kind of almost detune it a little bit. So without. That can sound really good. So any changes we're making using the LFO are effectively still being mapped to this sine layer as well. Okay, for this last example, I guess I just wanted to show how much fun you can have by experimenting with different snap-ins. There's a lot of great presets within some of these snap-ins as well, and just kind of get creative, setting up lots of different pathways, trying all sorts of different stuff in combination, assigning different parameters to, or multiple parameters to individual macros, and then experimenting with combinations of macros to really get some new and interesting textures, which is really what I think Reese Bass sound design all comes down to, is having great texture. The original Reese had that great resonant warmth, and we've looked at how you can explore distortion and filtering to create different textures as well. And now we've got all these other tools available to us in terms of formant filters, for example, new and creative snap-ins like the disperser one, which is a great and unique snap-in within Phase Plant, comb filtering, all sorts of stuff. So let's just have a listen to how this particular sound sounds to start with. So really low, thick, gritty kind of bass sound. Let's play around with some of these macros. So you can hear that's kind of really twisting the sound. Let's listen to, or see what this one's doing. So this is controlling the mix of this multi-pass snap in here. So multi-pass, as I think I mentioned earlier, is really a whole effects, a multi-band effects processing snap-in within Phase Plant, and of course you can have multiple of these as well. This particular one, it has a frequency shifter on this signal coming in, it has another one shifted the other way on the way out. It has two bands, both with distortion running through them. It has an LFO controlling the tuning of these two to give it kind of additional movement. And it also has this audio follower. So this is taking the output of our main phase plant audio, and in this case it's also then applying this to the tuning. So this is currently all the way down. But if we start to bring this up, we can hear how we can start to use some weird frequency shifting tuning on the sound as well, based on the sound that we're generating in the first place, which is a kind of a weird sort of feedback loop way of modulating the sound. So it's quite mangled, but there's definitely some cool textures in there, and we could kind of tweak that a little bit to get something that's usable. Down in those low values, we're getting some really cool stuff there as well. So that's just to give you one example within this particular preset. We've also got some other controls doing weird stuff. We've got a vibrato macro as well. So yeah, this one works quite interestingly. This is on, which multipass is it? This one here. So again, this is actually just a vibrato preset from the multipass library of different effects processing. The way that this one works, you can see that the depth is being controlled by this LFO here. We've again got an audio follower controlling the depth, but the mix of the delay is really the main thing. So that's controlled by this macro up here. And so what it's doing is actually just adding a delayed signal to create the vibrato effect, and we can control the rate of that as well. And this sounds really good when we start to combine it with pitch bend. So that kind of really gnarly, like neurofunk, almost neuro horn, foghorn style bass sound. We can bring in some this kind of comb flanging effect through this comb filter that we've got set up here. Just some nice texture, kind of reminiscent of some of the unison type of effects that we saw in earlier presets. We control the amount of fuzz, so this is controlling yet another distortion plugin. And what I would say as well, a good thing to do when designing these sounds and to get some interesting combinations of textures is to, rather than just use one style of distortion, use lots of little bits of styles of distortion in combination to kind of, and you know, experiment with the order that you're playing these through as well, and that can create some really interesting textures. We've also got things like formant filters. So the X and Y axis are controlling formants with, you can see in here the actual different sounds of the formants, and so we can kind of map a path through here by controlling this with different modulation. In this case it's an LFO controlling the X and Y amounts in different amounts, so that can kind of create movement in other ways as well. If I just turn off some of the other stuff, you'll hear a bit more clearly. And again, we can automate all this stuff to really fine tune and create some interesting textures and design everything a bit more deliberately. So this is a really fun and creative way of exploring different textures and designing modern sounding Reese basses. So I hope you've enjoyed this 3-part mini-series all about Reese bass sound design with myself, DC Breaks, here for the DBS Institute. If you want to get more videos like this, please subscribe to the channel. And if you have any questions about anything that I've covered in this video or the other parts, please drop them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer those for you. I will no doubt be back soon with some more videos all about sound design. So watch this space and I'll see you in the next one.